So, peace can't wait, and a child will lead them. Yesterday, Greta and I went to Starbucks to do a little work. She brought her homework with her, and I brought all my thoughts as I was trying to pull together for the message today. I had all these ideas swirling around in my head, and I was hoping to just kind of get them lined up a little bit more. I'd been reading Isaiah, and I was thinking about how this week peace can't wait. But I have to tell you that the Merle Hay parking lot is not a peaceful place on the first Sunday in December. The coffee shop was super busy, and we sat on the table that was facing out to the drive-through, and so we just could see a never-ending stream of cars that were kind of creeping through the drive-through, waiting for their afternoon pick-me-up. And then inside, the coffee shop was filled with shoppers who were taking a break from hunting for their holiday treasures. We were concentrating, or at least we were trying to, alternating between deep thought and distraction, when over the noise of the conversation and the crooning Starbucks music came a sound of pure joy and innocence. Loud enough to be heard over the cacophony of this very busy coffee shop, a small girl sang out at the top of her lungs, "Go tell it on the mountain, over the hills and everywhere. Go tell it on the mountain that Jesus Christ is born." It was so loud and so clear, and it just rang out over top of everything. It was beautifully sweet, and I just couldn't help but be swept up by her joy as she sang her heart out. Now, her grown-ups were deep in conversation, and they didn't even really seem to be noticing that she was performing a concert for the whole coffee shop. And I was super impressed, too, because she knew all the words, not just the first verse, but the second verse. And she sang them out clearly and with confidence. Over the hills and everywhere included the Starbucks on a Saturday afternoon. So here I was looking and searching and struggling for the words to speak peace into our waiting, and I wasn't feeling overly peaceful when this voice of joy, this innocent voice of a child with her eyes set on the baby Jesus, got my attention. God with us in utter vulnerability. So she pulled me out of my head, and I thought, wow, of course, a child will lead us. As she left, she was smiling and she was playing her straw like a trumpet. I was just so thankful for just that tiny little glimpse of the world through her eyes. It was joyful and magical and full of promise, not at all burdened by the stresses that seemed to be weighing down all of the grown-ups in the room. A child shall lead us. I love the book of Isaiah. It is full of so much vivid imagery. It's poetry that helps us to envision a world that is so just and so peaceful that we can hardly fathom it. We can struggle to recognize it in the world in which we live. Our passage today starts with a vision of a tree, a stump actually, with a little tiny branch emerging. Now, if you've ever cut down a tree, perhaps you've witnessed these little tenacious sprouts that just seem to find a way to pop up. We cut down an unhealthy tree a couple of years ago. We drilled out the stump and we filled it up with dirt and we planted grass, and still there are tiny little trees that are growing up out from the roots. Faster than the grass grows, so it looks great, much to the dismay of John, our master mower-in-chief. But as it turns out, a tree stump with tenacious sprouts that we hear about in Isaiah is actually a family tree. It is the root of Jesse, which is full of meaning because Jesse was King David's father. So in the context of this passage, Isaiah, it's going through a rough time for the Israelites. And any way you look at it, there's some debate as to what the exact context might be, but no matter where you place it, Judah, from which Isaiah is writing, is vulnerable. Perhaps they are looking out at their very strong neighbors, the Assyrians, who have already done some incredibly serious damage to the northern kingdom of Israel and would eventually bring about their end. Judah is very vulnerable. They're not in charge of their own destiny. Their peace and their security are illusions, and the illusions are just hanging on by a thread. I'm sure that the people to whom these words were written were fearful, and perhaps they looked around and saw David's family tree, from which they drew their hope and their identity in the process of being chopped down. The promise of the Davidic covenant going down with it. The people are afraid, and with good cause. The stump was all that they had left of their former glory, and there was more danger that was looming on the horizon. So, how hopeful to hear that a sprout could come even from the roots, even after the tree had been cut down. You see, the lions and the leopards and the snakes in Isaiah 11 are metaphors for real live threats. Judah had predatory neighbors. Could they dare to imagine a peace in which their powerful neighbors and their vulnerable nation could live right next door without violence and fear? It's interesting to note that in Isaiah, the dream is not to destroy the adversary, but it is to live in peace right next door, side by side. In the midst of the anxiety and insecurity, Isaiah points to the promise of a new king in the line of David, one who will be just and whose reign will usher in peace and harmony. That had to just be music to the ears of the people of Judah. Even as the world appears to be crumbling all around them, Isaiah encourages the people to have hope for the future, reminding them that God is in the process of creating something new, even in the midst of their current uncertainty. These passages from Isaiah fall within Advent in the lectionary because they point to the Messiah, which is a title that means anointed one. It's a title that Israel used for the kings in the line of David. The earliest Christians and the writers of the gospel saw Jesus in these words. They saw Jesus as the fulfillment of these promises. In the Christian tradition, we read Isaiah's promise of a child born with the title Prince of Peace, and we see Jesus. Isaiah imagines a new leader that is the hope and the promise of the future, and we see Jesus. So if Jesus is this Prince of Peace, as Isaiah imagines, then he is an advocate for the vulnerable and a proponent of nonviolent conflict resolution. And the kind of peace that's being talked about here isn't a wimpy kind of peace. The Prince of Peace understands that justice is the only way to true peace. So if we're truly waiting for the kingdom of the Prince of Peace to be made real right here among us, then this vision of Isaiah is the Messiah that we're looking for. The Messiah whose way we are to follow. The Messiah who as the church we are to embody in the world. Which would mean that we would advocate for the vulnerable, that we would resolve our conflicts nonviolently, and that we would insist on justice on the road to peace. The peace that Isaiah speaks of is not the peace through strength, empire kind of peace, but it is a peace that is achieved through vulnerability. Reading this passage from Isaiah, it's kind of funny to think that people would have imagined a military might as a Messiah, because that doesn't seem to be what Isaiah is describing at all. The description of the promised leader that Isaiah envisions, there is some strong language. This leader is going to strike down the violent and going to kill the wicked, and that sounds super, super harsh. But did you happen to notice the weapon that would be used to accomplish this? The leader will kill the wicked by the breath of his lips. The Hebrew word that is translated breath in this passage is ruach, the word that is also translated spirit or wind. This is the same word that is used for the spirit that hovered over the waters of the deep in the creation story in Genesis. Creative spirit, breath, wind is the weapon for defeating wickedness and creating a new thing, a peaceful order. And yet, doesn't that feel beautifully counterintuitive in the world that we live in? But so is the rest of the stuff in this passage. The peace in this poem is incredible and not at all what we have experienced. The wolf will live with the lamb, and the leopard will lie down with the young goat. The calf and the young lion will feed together. The cow and the bear will graze. Their young will lie down together, and a lion will eat straw like an ox. A nursing child will play over the snake's hole. Toddlers will reach right over the serpent's den and not be afraid at all. Wow. This kind of peace is one in which there's an absence of danger. There is no fear, but this is not accomplished by destroying the predator, but rather by transforming the predator. The predatory instinct seems to be overcome somehow, and the trust in this vision is amazing. Can you even imagine a mama cow having enough trust to let her babies lay right next to the bears, and a young calf and a lion sharing a meal together? This is not at all what you would expect if you were watching Animal Planet. It's not the way it works. It's kind of hard for us to imagine. But true divine peace seems to be kind of counterintuitive for us because it is the opposite of empire peace. Empire peace says peace via vulnerability. Are you crazy? No wonder Jesus spoke to the disciples of a peace that surpasses understanding, the kind of peace that sounds counter to everything that we experience. This kind of peace is different from the kind of peace that the empire seeks to promote. It's not a peace where we protect our best interest at the expense of others, securing our privilege of security by endangering someone else's. Walter Brueggemann said this kind of true peace, this Prince of Peace, Shalom, is different because it requires a capacity to forgive. It requires a readiness to share generously. Peace requires the violation of strict class stratification in society. Peace requires attentiveness to the vulnerable and the unproductive. Peace requires humility in the face of exaltation, being last among those who insist on being first, and denying self in the interest of neighbors. This is the kind of peace that sort of flies in the face of empire, in which the mighty make the rules. In this vision, a child will lead. In the Jewish Publication Society translation, this "a child will lead" reads, "and a little boy will herd them." I like the idea of a little shepherd boy that is caring for a diverse flock that lives in peace, the powerful and the powerless, living in harmony and equity. A little boy shall herd them is beautiful because, of course, it points to David, which connects us with that messianic covenant. But it is also reminding us of a time when someone who was chosen to lead was not the oldest and was not the strongest, and yet was chosen and anointed for the job. The powerless, the vulnerable will lead. Peace is achieved by a reversal of power structures. Maybe not a complete reversal, because it's not about converting the lowly into the mighty, but it's about leveling the playing field, where the lowly and the mighty might lie side by side, the mighty yielding to the voice of the weak. This passage from Isaiah this week has had me really thinking about the relationship between vulnerability and strength. Peace can't wait. The vision of peace in Isaiah seems to involve the vulnerable and the strong living side by side in harmony. Now, when we read these poems and these prayers inside of Scripture, there are a lot of different layers and different ways that we can think about this. There are community layers and there are personal layers. The peace that passes understanding had me pondering the inner life this week. I think within us, we all have vulnerabilities and we have strengths. And I think that vulnerability and strength are both gifts. They are assets that can be life-giving and community building, but they can also be liabilities that are life-limiting and destructive. We have within us the capacity for both weakness and aggression. Perhaps if we reflect, we might think of times in our lives where we could relate to both a predator or also to prey. So how is it that what is in us that is vulnerable and what is in us that is strong can work together so that we can experience this true peace that is not dependent upon our circumstance, a peace that surpasses understanding? Peace can't wait. And yet we look around and we realize that we do not live in peace. In ways both big and small, peace often just seems beyond our grasp. What if it was the vulnerable who need to lead if we actually desire true peace? How do we learn to lean into our own vulnerability so that we are able to engage our neighbor from this place? What if in our relationships and our communities, that means that we must yield the floor to the voices that are all too often overlooked, overpowered, and often silenced by the powerful? Being vulnerable is not for the faint of heart. The truth is, vulnerability, particularly the kind of vulnerability that we have to choose to engage and that isn't just something that we are burdened with because of our circumstance, this kind of vulnerability that we choose takes great strength and courage. It takes trust and faith. It isn't easy. And sometimes it can seem pointless and dangerous, and it is always a risk for sure. And then just when it seems to be too much, when we look around and we witness the strong predators of our world running over the vulnerable at any chance that they get. Just when it seems hopeless, when it seems that we watch the powerful take advantage of the weak time and time again, Isaiah reminds us that from the seemingly dead stump, a sprig of life emerges. A tiny little tendril in an unexpected place. Or if it's anything like that stump in our yard, tons of tiny little tendrils that are coming up in all kinds of unexpected places. So how do we go about training our eyes to look for the shoots, to look for the new life, that when we are tempted to only notice the stump? Can we be brave enough to imagine that God might be up to something new? The breath, the spirit, the wind, the ruach that is stirring over the depths of our chaos, could it actually be creating something new? I hope so, because peace can't wait. I want to look for the sprigs of hope pointing to peace. And then I want to go tell it on the mountain. I want to be led by a little child, to live in a world where nothing at all would stop me from using my straw as a trumpet, heralding in a new vision that really is an ancient vision that we must discover anew, time and time again. Sprig by tiny little tenacious sprig.